In the shadows of Japan's early history, long before the word ninja was ever written, there existed a world defined by instability, fragmented power, and constant conflict. To understand the origins of the ninja, you cannot begin with stealth assassins in black clothing. You have to begin with a country struggling to hold itself together. During the Heian period, Japan was ruled by an imperial court in Kyoto, but real political control was already slipping away. Powerful aristocratic families and emerging military clans were beginning to dominate regional territories. Law was inconsistent, communication was slow, and central authority was often too weak to enforce peace outside the capital. In these conditions, warfare was not just common, it was expected. But war in early Japan was not yet the highly structured battlefield system it would later become. It was fragmented, personal, and often unpredictable. Small groups of warriors served local lords, and survival depended as much on intelligence and awareness as it did on strength. In this unstable environment, certain skills began to emerge that would later form the foundation of what we now call ninjutsu. These early developments were not yet ninja in any formal sense. Instead, they were a collection of survival techniques, scouting practices, and unconventional warfare methods used by individuals who needed to operate outside the boundaries of traditional samurai warfare. Some were soldiers, others were monks, and many were simply people living in remote regions where survival required adaptability above all else. One of the earliest influences on these developing practices came indirectly from continental Asia. Chinese military philosophy, especially texts associated with Sun Tzu, emphasized deception, intelligence gathering, and indirect strategy. While Japan did not adopt these ideas directly in a structured military doctrine at the time, the concepts slowly filtered through cultural and diplomatic exchanges. The idea that winning a conflict without direct confrontation was superior to brute force began to take root in certain strategic circles. At the same time, Japan had its own parallel development happening in remote mountainous regions. These areas were often cut off from central authority and developed their own cultural and spiritual systems. Among the most influential groups in these regions were ascetic mountain practitioners known as Yamabushi. These were wandering monks who trained themselves through extreme physical endurance, meditation, and survival in harsh natural environments. The Yamabushi were not warriors in the traditional sense, but they possessed a wide range of practical skills. They understood herbal medicine, navigation through mountainous terrain, weather prediction, and psychological discipline. Over time, their knowledge of survival and concealment would become deeply intertwined with early covert practices. While they were primarily spiritual figures, their lifestyle naturally aligned with the kind of adaptability required for irregular warfare. As Japan moved toward the Kamakura period, the country experienced a shift in power from aristocratic courts to military governments. The rise of the samurai class marked a turning point in Japanese history. For the first time, warriors became the dominant political force, and military service became a structured social identity. However, even within this more organized system, warfare remained chaotic and regionally diverse. Large-scale battles existed, but so did ambushes, raids, and intelligence operations. As conflicts between rival clans increased, it became clear that open battlefield strength alone was not enough to guarantee victory. Information about enemy movement, terrain, and strategy became just as valuable as swords and armor. This is where early forms of covert operations began to develop more clearly. In rural and mountainous regions, especially areas that were difficult for central authorities to control, local communities began to specialize in unconventional survival tactics. These regions were often overlooked by the major powers, which gave them a unique level of autonomy. People living in these areas developed methods for defending themselves that did not rely on traditional military formations. It is within this environment that the earliest recognizable forms of shinobi activity began to take shape. The word shinobi itself is derived from a concept meaning endurance, stealth, or concealment. Rather than describing a specific class of warrior, it referred to a method of operating, remaining unseen, gathering intelligence, and acting in ways that avoided direct confrontation whenever possible. Unlike samurai, whose identity was built around honor, visibility, and structured combat, these early operatives worked in secrecy. Their success depended on blending into their surroundings, observing without being noticed, and moving between enemy territories without detection. In many cases, they would disguise themselves as monks, merchants, or travelers, using social roles as tools for infiltration. One of the most significant regions where these practices developed was the mountainous area of Iga. Located far from major political centers, Iga was geographically isolated, which meant central governments struggled to maintain control over it. As a result, local families and communities developed their own defensive systems. Over time, these systems evolved into networks of clans that shared survival knowledge and irregular combat techniques. In Iga, these clans were not unified under a single leader, but were connected through alliances and shared interests. Families passed down knowledge through generations, including techniques for movement through difficult terrain, disguise, observation, and escape. These were not written doctrines at first, but practical knowledge learned through experience and necessity. A similar development occurred in the neighboring region of Koga. However, Koga's system was more decentralized. Instead of a few dominant families, there were many smaller groups, each specializing in different aspects of covert survival. Some focused on medicine and poisons, others on infiltration, and others on intelligence gathering. While Iga became known for its structured clan networks, Koga became known for flexibility and diversity of skills. At this stage in history, it is important to understand that there was no unified organization called ninjas. That concept would come much later. Instead, there were overlapping traditions of irregular warfare and survival expertise that varied by region and circumstance. The idea of a ninja as a standardized figure is a modern simplification of a much more complex reality. As conflicts continued to escalate toward the Sengoku period, Japan entered one of the most violent eras in its history. The country fractured into dozens of competing warlord domains, each fighting for survival and expansion. Battles were constant, alliances were temporary, and betrayal was common. In this environment, intelligence became one of the most valuable resources in warfare. It is during this time that shinobi activity becomes more clearly documented. Warlords began actively employing individuals skilled in espionage, sabotage, and infiltration. These operatives were used to gather information about enemy castles, troop movements, and supply lines. They were also used to spread misinformation, weaken morale, and create confusion within enemy ranks. However, their role was not limited to sabotage or assassination, as modern fiction often suggests. In reality, their most important function was reconnaissance. Knowing where the enemy was, how many forces they had, and what strategies they intended to use could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. In some cases, shinobi were also used to guide important figures safely through hostile territory. Their knowledge of terrain, secret routes, and safe houses made them invaluable in situations where traditional armies could not move safely. This combination of intelligence, navigation, and disguise made them uniquely suited for asymmetric warfare. As their importance grew, certain families and individuals became especially renowned for their skills. However, even then, their identities remained deliberately obscure. Secrecy was not just a tactic, it was a necessity. Exposure meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death in a world where political power shifted constantly. By the end of this early formation period, the foundations of what would later be called ninja practices were firmly established, but they were still not a unified identity. They were a collection of survival techniques shaped by geography, war, and necessity. This is where the story truly begins, not with legends, not with mythology, but with a fractured nation where survival required intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to disappear when necessary. As Japan moved deeper into the age of constant warfare, the scattered survival techniques and regional knowledge that had once existed independently began to take on a more structured form. What had started as necessity in isolated regions was now becoming a system, one that warlords could rely on, fear, and attempt to control. The transition into the Sengoku period marked a turning point. This was not just another era of conflict. It was a complete breakdown of national unity. The authority of the shogunate weakened, and regional daimyo rose in power, each fighting to expand their territory. Alliances formed and collapsed with little warning. Castles were built not just as symbols of power, but as defensive fortresses in a land where attack could come at any time. In this environment, information became as valuable as soldiers. Knowing the layout of an enemy's castle, the number of troops they commanded, or even the morale of their forces could determine the outcome of a campaign before a single battle was fought. This demand for intelligence transformed shinobi from scattered practitioners into organized networks. In the region of Iga, these networks became increasingly sophisticated. Families that had once operated independently began to cooperate more closely, forming alliances that allowed them to share information and coordinate efforts. These were not armies in the traditional sense, but they functioned as something equally powerful, a decentralized intelligence system. Certain families began to specialize further. Some focused on infiltration, mastering the art of entering enemy territory undetected. Others specialized in reconnaissance, observing movements and reporting back with precise detail. There were also those who focused on sabotage, using fire, tools, and timing to disrupt supply lines or damage critical infrastructure. The knowledge required for these roles was extensive. Shinobi needed to understand terrain, weather patterns, human behavior, and even social customs. Disguise was not simply about changing clothing. It required the ability to convincingly act as someone else, whether that meant adopting the mannerisms of a traveling monk, the speech patterns of a merchant, or the posture of a laborer. A single mistake could expose them. In Koga, a different but equally effective system developed. Rather than forming tight-knit alliances like Iga, Koga became a network of smaller, semi-independent families. Each group developed its own specialties, and cooperation was often based on mutual benefit rather than formal structure. This made Koga shinobi highly adaptable, able to operate in a wide range of situations without relying on a central command. One of the key advantages of both Iga and Koga was geography. Their mountainous terrain made large-scale military invasions difficult. This allowed them to maintain a level of independence that other regions could not. It also meant that their people were naturally skilled at navigating difficult landscapes, an ability that became essential in covert operations. As the reputation of these regions grew, warlords began to actively seek out their services. Hiring shinobi was not a sign of weakness, it was a strategic decision. Daimyo understood that conventional warfare had limits. There were situations where an army could not reach, but a single skilled operative could. Shinobi were used to infiltrate enemy castles, sometimes posing as servants or laborers. Once inside, they would gather information about defenses, troop numbers, and vulnerabilities. In some cases, they would open gates for incoming forces or set fires to create chaos during an attack. Timing was critical. A well-placed fire or a single opened gate at the right moment could turn the tide of a battle. But infiltration was only one part of their role. Shinobi were also masters of psychological warfare. They spread rumors, created confusion, and manipulated information to weaken enemy morale. In a time when communication was slow and often unreliable, misinformation could spread quickly and cause panic. For example, false reports of troop movements could force an enemy to reposition their forces unnecessarily, weakening their defenses. Rumors about betrayal within a clan could create distrust among allies. These tactics required a deep understanding of human psychology, not just physical skill. Despite their growing importance, shinobi remained outsiders in the rigid social structure of feudal Japan. The samurai class valued honor, loyalty, and open combat. Shinobi methods, which relied on deception and secrecy, did not fit easily within this code. As a result, shinobi were often viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion. Some daimyo embraced their usefulness, integrating them into their strategies. Others distrusted them, seeing their methods as dishonorable or dangerous. This tension added another layer of complexity to their role. Shinobi had to navigate not only enemy territory, but also the politics of those who employed them. During this time, certain individuals began to gain recognition for their skills. However, unlike samurai heroes whose names were recorded in detail, shinobi identities were often deliberately obscured. Their effectiveness depended on anonymity. Fame could be a liability. Training during this period became more refined. Techniques were passed down within families, often in secret. Knowledge was not written openly, but transmitted through practice and oral instruction. This ensured that only trusted members had access to the full range of skills. These techniques included methods of silent movement, use of simple tools for climbing and entry, and strategies for escaping pursuit. They also included survival skills, such as finding food in the wild, treating injuries, and enduring extreme conditions. Shinobi were expected to operate alone or in small groups, often far from support. One of the most important developments during this period was the increasing use of coordinated operations. Rather than acting individually, groups of shinobi would sometimes work together to achieve complex objectives. This required communication, planning, and trust, all while maintaining secrecy. As their influence expanded, shinobi became deeply integrated into the fabric of Sengoku warfare. They were not the dominant force on the battlefield, but they shaped the conditions under which battles were fought. They influenced decisions, exposed weaknesses, and created opportunities that conventional forces could exploit. However, this growing influence also attracted attention. Powerful warlords began to see regions like Iga not just as sources of skilled operatives, but as potential threats. Their independence and specialized knowledge made them difficult to control. This would eventually lead to direct conflict. By the late Sengoku period, the relationship between shinobi regions and major warlords was becoming increasingly tense. What had once been a mutually beneficial arrangement was turning into a struggle for control. The same skills that made shinobi valuable also made them dangerous in the eyes of those who sought to unify Japan. This tension would soon erupt into some of the most significant events in ninja history, including large-scale campaigns against the Iga region and the scattering of its people across the country. These events would reshape the role of shinobi forever, forcing them to adapt once again to a changing world. As the Sengoku period reached its most violent and unstable phase, the role of shinobi expanded to its peak. This was no longer a time of scattered regional conflict. It was a nationwide struggle for dominance, where a handful of powerful warlords sought to unify Japan under their rule. In this environment, the value of intelligence, deception, and covert action became undeniable. Among the most ambitious and ruthless of these warlords was Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was not just a military leader, he was a revolutionary strategist who embraced new tactics, new weapons, and new ways of thinking about warfare. He understood the importance of information, but he also understood the danger posed by independent groups who possessed it. The regions of Iga and Koga, with their long traditions of autonomous shinobi activity, stood as both an asset and a threat. Their ability to operate independently made them valuable, but it also meant they were difficult to control. For a man like Nobunaga, who sought absolute dominance, this independence was unacceptable. Before direct conflict began, shinobi from these regions were actively involved across Japan. They served various daimyo, often switching allegiances based on survival and opportunity. Their missions during this time became increasingly complex. Infiltrating fortified castles required not only physical skill, but also detailed planning. Shinobi would spend days or even weeks studying routines, observing guard patterns, and identifying weaknesses. In some cases, they entered as laborers during construction, embedding themselves inside enemy strongholds long before any attack took place. In others, they traveled disguised as merchants, gathering information under the cover of trade. Every role they adopted was calculated, every movement deliberate. One of their most powerful tools was not physical at all, but psychological. Shinobi understood that fear could be just as destructive as fire or steel. By spreading rumors, staging small but visible acts of sabotage, or even leaving behind subtle signs of their presence, they could create a sense of paranoia within enemy ranks. Soldiers who feared unseen enemies were more likely to make mistakes. Despite their effectiveness, the independence of regions like Iga made them a target. In 1579, Nobunaga launched his first campaign against Iga. This initial invasion was not fully successful. The defenders, using their knowledge of terrain and unconventional tactics, resisted effectively. For a moment, it seemed that the decentralized strength of Iga could withstand even one of the most powerful armies in Japan. But Nobunaga was not a man who accepted failure easily. In 1581, he returned with overwhelming force in what is now known as the Tensho-Iga War. This was not a simple battle. It was a coordinated, large-scale invasion designed to crush resistance completely. Thousands of soldiers advanced into the mountainous region, attacking from multiple directions. The defenders of Iga fought back using every advantage they had: ambushes, hidden routes, and knowledge of the terrain. But against such overwhelming numbers, resistance could not last indefinitely. The campaign ended in devastation. Villages were destroyed, families were scattered, and the organized networks of Iga were effectively dismantled. For Shinobi history, this was a turning point. What had once been a strong, independent center of covert practice was now broken. However, this was not the end of Shinobi activity. It was a transformation. Survivors of Iga did what they had always done best: they adapted. Many fled to other regions, carrying their knowledge with them. Instead of operating as independent clans, they began to integrate into the service of powerful daimyo. Their skills were too valuable to disappear, even if their homeland had been destroyed. Around the same time, another major event reshaped the political landscape of Japan. In 1582, Oda Nobunaga was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, in what became known as the Honnojai Incident. Nobunaga was caught off guard and forced to take his own life as his temple burned. This sudden shift in power created chaos. Alliances were thrown into uncertainty, and the race to control Japan intensified. It was in this moment of instability that Shinobi once again proved their importance. One of the key figures who benefited from this was Tokugawa Ieyasu. At the time of Nobunaga's death, Ieyasu was in a vulnerable position, far from his home territory and surrounded by potential enemies. His survival depended on navigating hostile land quickly and safely. This is where Shinobi played a critical role. Guides familiar with secret routes and hidden paths helped Ieyasu escape danger and return to safety. Among those associated with this effort was Hattori Hanzo, a figure who would later become one of the most famous names connected to ninja history. Hanzo himself was a samurai, but he had strong ties to the Iga region and its shinobi traditions. Under his leadership, groups of former Iga operatives were organized into effective units that served Tokugawa. This marked a significant shift in how shinobi operated. They were no longer independent actors. They were becoming integrated into formal power structures. As the struggle for control of Japan continued, shinobi were used not just for espionage, but also for coordination between allied forces. Communication during this time was slow and dangerous. Messages could be intercepted, and messengers could be captured. Shinobi, with their ability to move unseen, became essential for maintaining secure lines of communication. Their role in shaping events was often invisible, but it was deeply influential. They did not command armies or lead charges into battle, but they influenced decisions, enabled movements, and exposed weaknesses that others could exploit. By the end of the Sengoku period, the nature of warfare in Japan was beginning to change once again. The rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu would soon bring an end to the constant state of war that had defined the era. With unification came stability, and with stability came a decline in the need for large-scale covert operations. For shinobi, this meant another transformation was approaching. The skills that had once been essential for survival in a fragmented nation would have to find a new purpose in a unified one. The destruction of Iga, the fall of Nobunaga, and the rise of Tokugawa marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The age of chaos that had given birth to the ninja was coming to a close. As the chaos of the Sengoku period came to an end, Japan entered a new chapter under the rule of Tokugawa Ieyasu. After his decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara, Ieyasu established a government that would bring over 2.5 centuries of relative peace. This period, known as the Edo era, reshaped nearly every aspect of Japanese society, including the role of shinobi. For generations, shinobi had existed because of chaos. War had created the demand for espionage, sabotage, and covert movement. But now, with the country unified and tightly controlled, that demand began to disappear. Large-scale battles were no longer constant, and the need for independent covert operatives declined. However, the skills of the shinobi were too valuable to simply vanish. Instead of disappearing, they adapted once again, this time into roles that fit within a structured and peaceful society. Under the Tokugawa government, control was everything. The shogunate implemented strict systems to monitor daimyo, regulate movement, and maintain stability across the country. In such a system, information remained important, but it was no longer about enemy warlords. It was about internal security. Former shinobi, especially those connected to Iga, were brought into official service. Some became guards, others became intelligence agents working directly for the shogunate. One notable example is the group often referred to as the Iga Guards, who were tasked with protecting key areas of Edo, including the castle where the shogun resided. These individuals were no longer operating in the shadows as independent agents. They were now part of the system they once existed outside of. Their knowledge of stealth, observation, and surveillance made them ideal for maintaining order rather than disrupting it. The nature of their work also changed. Instead of infiltrating enemy castles, they monitored potential threats within the population. Instead of sabotaging supply lines, they tracked suspicious activity. Their focus shifted from warfare to policing and intelligence gathering. This transformation highlights an important truth about shinobi. They were never defined by a fixed role. They were defined by adaptability. In times of war, they became spies and infiltrators. In times of peace, they became observers and enforcers. During this period, knowledge that had once been closely guarded within families began to be recorded in written form. One of the most significant examples is the Bansen Shukai, a comprehensive text compiled in the late 1600s. This document attempted to preserve the techniques, philosophies, and strategies associated with ninjutsu. The Bansen Shukai did not present ninjutsu as a collection of dramatic combat skills. Instead, it emphasized patience, strategy, and intelligence. It included detailed discussions on topics such as disguise, psychology, weather patterns, and even the importance of understanding human behavior. The text made it clear that the true strength of a shinobi was not physical ability alone, but the ability to think, adapt, and remain unnoticed. Other texts, such as the Shininki and Ninpaidan, also contributed to preserving this knowledge. Together, these works form the foundation of what we know about historical ninjutsu today. However, even these documents were not widely distributed. They were intended for limited audiences, ensuring that the knowledge remained controlled. At the same time, the image of the shinobi began to shift in the public imagination. With fewer real-world examples of their activities, stories about their past began to circulate more freely. These stories were often exaggerated, blending fact with fiction. In theater, particularly in forms like kabuki, characters resembling ninjas began to appear. These portrayals emphasized dramatic entrances, acrobatic movements, and distinctive costumes. One of the most influential developments during this time was the use of stagehands dressed in black, who were meant to be invisible to the audience. Over time, this theatrical convention contributed to the idea that ninjas themselves wore all-black outfits. In reality, historical shinobi avoided standing out. They dressed to blend in, not to be seen. But as their real-world presence faded, their fictional image began to take shape. This shift from reality to legend was gradual but powerful. The less people saw of actual shinobi, the more space there was for imagination. Stories grew more dramatic, abilities became more exaggerated, and the line between history and myth began to blur. Despite this, the underlying principles of ninjutsu did not disappear. They continued to exist in quieter forms, passed down through families or preserved in texts. While the era of large-scale shinobi operations had ended, the knowledge itself remained. It is also important to recognize that the Tokugawa period was not entirely free of conflict. There were still political tensions, local disputes, and the constant need to maintain control over a large and diverse population. In this context, the skills of observation, intelligence gathering, and subtle influence remained valuable. However, the role of shinobi had fundamentally changed. They were no longer shaping the outcome of wars. They were helping to maintain a system designed to prevent war from happening again. As the Edo period continued, Japan became increasingly isolated from the outside world. This isolation limited external influences, but also preserved internal traditions. The legacy of the shinobi, though no longer visible in the same way, remained embedded within this controlled and stable society. By the time the Edo period began to decline in the 1800s, the world that had created the ninja was long gone. The chaotic battlefields of the Sengoku era had been replaced by structured governance and social order. The need for covert operatives had diminished, and with it, the active practice of ninjutsu began to fade. But as history has shown, the end of a practice does not mean the end of its story. In many ways, this was only the beginning of a new transformation, one that would carry the image of the ninja far beyond the borders of Japan and into global culture. By the early 19th century, the world that had once given rise to shinobi was beginning to collapse. The stability of the Tokugawa system, which had lasted for over 250 years, was slowly eroding. Internal pressures, economic strain, and growing dissatisfaction among different social classes were weakening the foundations of the shogunate. At the same time, an external force was approaching, one that Japan could no longer ignore. In 1853, American naval officer Matthew Perry arrived with a fleet of ships, demanding that Japan open its ports to foreign trade. This event, often referred to as the arrival of the Black Ships, marked the beginning of the end for Japan's long period of isolation. The Tokugawa government, already struggling to maintain control, was forced into unequal agreements with foreign powers. This led to widespread unrest across the country. Samurai, peasants, and political leaders began to question the legitimacy of the shogunate. The system that had maintained peace for centuries was no longer sustainable. In 1868, This tension erupted into what is known as the Meiji Restoration. The Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown, and power was returned to the emperor. Japan began a rapid process of modernization, adopting Western technology, military systems, and political structures. This transformation was dramatic and immediate. The feudal system was dismantled, samurai lost their privileged status, castles were abandoned or repurposed. The entire structure of society was rebuilt in a matter of decades. For the remnants of shinobi traditions, this change was devastating. The roles that had once defined them, espionage in feudal warfare, covert operations between rival domains, no longer existed. Warfare itself was changing, becoming more industrialized and centralized. Intelligence gathering was now handled by modern institutions rather than small, independent groups. Many descendants of shinobi families were forced to adapt to entirely new ways of life. Some became farmers, others entered government service, and some moved into urban professions. The specialized knowledge that had once been essential for survival was no longer in demand. As a result, much of that knowledge was lost. Unlike samurai traditions, which were documented and celebrated, shinobi practices had always been secretive. Techniques were passed down privately, often within families. When those families were forced to abandon their roles, there was little incentive or ability to preserve that knowledge in a systematic way. However, not everything disappeared. Some aspects of ninjutsu survived in fragmented forms, preserved through texts, oral traditions, and small groups that continued to study and practice certain techniques. But these were no longer part of a larger system. They were remnants of a past that no longer existed. At the same time, something unexpected began to happen. As real shinobi faded from existence, their stories began to grow. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Japan experienced a cultural shift. As the country modernized, there was a growing interest in its past. Writers, artists, and performers began to revisit historical themes, drawing inspiration from earlier periods. In this process, the image of the ninja began to change. Without real-world examples to anchor them, stories about shinobi became more imaginative. Their abilities were exaggerated. Their roles were simplified. Instead of complex operatives skilled in intelligence and survival, they became mysterious figures defined by stealth and combat. This transformation accelerated with the rise of modern media. In literature, ninjas were portrayed as shadowy assassins capable of extraordinary feats. In theater, their movements became more dramatic, their appearances more distinctive. And as Japan entered the age of film, these portrayals reached even wider audiences. By the mid-20th century, the ninja had become a recognizable cultural icon. Films and television shows presented them as highly skilled fighters with almost supernatural abilities. They moved silently, disappeared into darkness, and defeated enemies with ease. While these portrayals were entertaining, they were far removed from historical reality. The practical, intelligence-focused role of the shinobi was replaced by a more action-oriented image. The emphasis shifted from strategy to combat, from patience to speed, from invisibility to spectacle. This new image did not stay within Japan. As Japanese media began to reach global audiences, the concept of the ninja spread around the world. Western films, comics, and later video games adopted and adapted the idea, often amplifying the more fantastical elements. By the late 20th century, the ninja had become a global phenomenon. Characters inspired by ninjas appeared in countless forms of entertainment. They were heroes, villains, and everything in between. Their weapons, clothing, and techniques became instantly recognizable, even to people with little knowledge of Japanese history. However, this global popularity came with a cost. The more the ninja was represented in fiction, the further it drifted from its historical origins. The real shinobi, those who had navigated complex political landscapes, gathered intelligence, and survived in one of the most unstable periods in Japanese history, were largely forgotten. In their place stood a simplified, exaggerated version shaped by entertainment. Despite this, interest in the historical reality of ninjas never fully disappeared. Historians, researchers, and enthusiasts continued to study original texts and records, attempting to separate fact from fiction. Their work has helped to restore a more accurate understanding of what shinobi truly were. They were not mythical assassins with supernatural powers. They were highly adaptable individuals who operated in a world defined by uncertainty. Their greatest strength was not their ability to fight, but their ability to observe, plan, and survive. As Japan continued to modernize and integrate into the global community, the legend of the ninja continued to evolve. It became a symbol not just of stealth, but of mystery, discipline, and adaptability. And in many ways, that symbol proved to be more enduring than the reality itself. By the time Japan had fully entered the modern era, the world that created the shinobi was long gone. The battlefields of the Sengoku period had been replaced by modern armies. The isolated mountain regions that once fostered independent networks were now connected by roads, railways, and centralized governance. The conditions that had made ninjas necessary no longer existed. And yet their story did not end. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. As the 20th century progressed, the image of the ninjas spread far beyond Japan, evolving into something entirely new. Films, television, and later video games transformed them into global icons. They were no longer tied to a specific place or time. They became symbols of stealth, mystery, discipline, and power. But as their popularity grew, so did the distance between myth and reality. The modern image of the ninja is instantly recognizable, dressed in black, moving silently across rooftops, armed with exotic weapons, and capable of disappearing at will. This version of the ninja is dramatic and exciting, but it is largely a creation of storytelling rather than history. The black outfit, for example, is often assumed to be historically accurate. In reality, it comes from theatrical traditions, where stagehands dressed in black were meant to be invisible to the audience. Over time, this visual idea became associated with ninjas themselves. Historically, shinobi would have avoided such clothing, choosing instead to blend into their surroundings. Weapons, too, are often misunderstood. While certain tools associated with ninjas did exist, they were usually simple and practical. Rather than relying on specialized or exotic weapons, shinobi often adapted everyday objects for their purposes. Their goal was efficiency, not spectacle. Even the idea of the ninja as primarily an assassin is misleading. While assassination may have been one of many possible tasks, it was not their defining role. Their true value lay in intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and strategic influence. They were observers, planners, and survivors first, and fighters only when necessary. So why has the myth become so dominant? Part of the answer lies in storytelling itself. The real work of a shinobi, waiting, observing, gathering information, is not always visually exciting. It is subtle and often invisible, but stories thrive on action, conflict, and clear heroes and villains. By emphasizing combat and dramatic abilities, storytellers created a version of the ninja that was easier to understand and more engaging to watch. Another reason is that mystery invites imagination. Because shinobi operated in secrecy and left behind limited records, there are gaps in their history. Those gaps have been filled with speculation, exaggeration, and creative interpretation. Over time, these interpretations have become part of the popular understanding of what a ninja is. However, when you look beyond the myths, a different picture emerges. The real shinobi were products of their environment. They developed their skills in response to specific challenges, political instability, geographic isolation, and the constant threat of conflict. Their methods were shaped by necessity, not fantasy. They were not bound by a strict code like the samurai. Instead, they were defined by flexibility. They adapted to changing circumstances, using whatever tools and strategies were most effective. This adaptability is perhaps their most important legacy. In a world that was unpredictable and often dangerous, they found ways to survive, not through strength alone, but through intelligence and awareness. Even today, this idea remains relevant. While the specific techniques of ninjutsu belong to a particular historical context, the underlying principles, observation, patience, adaptability, and strategic thinking are universal. They can be applied far beyond the battlefield, in areas such as leadership, problem-solving, and even everyday life. This is one of the reasons why the story of the ninja continues to resonate. It is not just about hidden warriors in a distant past. It is about the ability to navigate uncertainty, to remain aware in complex situations, and to act with precision when it matters most. In recent years, there has also been a renewed effort to study and preserve the historical reality of shinobi. Researchers have examined original texts, archaeological evidence, and regional histories to better understand their role. Museums and cultural centers in regions like Iga have worked to present a more accurate picture, balancing myth with documented history. These efforts remind us that behind every legend, there is a foundation of truth. The ninja may no longer exist in the form they once did, but their influence remains, both in the stories we tell and in the lessons we can learn from them. From the mountains of Iga and Koga to the battlefields of the Sengoku period, from the structured peace of the Tokugawa era to the global stage of modern media, their journey has been one of constant transformation. They began as survivors in a fractured land, became essential players in a time of war, adapted to a world of peace, and ultimately evolved into one of the most enduring legends in human history. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. Because the true essence of the ninja was never about invisibility or combat. It was about adaptation. It was about understanding the world around you and finding a way to move through it, quietly, effectively, and intelligently. That is the story of the ninja. Like and subscribe and comment what topic you would like to see covered in the next video.